So we were talking about the importance of working with global communicative objectives. So there was an example here with expecting our students by the end of a lesson to discuss why their pet is more than a pet to them. So we unwrapped this global communicative objective, and we've got describing a pet, talking about what the pet does every day, talk about the pet's abilities, and compare that pet to other pets. So for that final task in which students will have to talk about why their pet is more than a pet to them, I have come up with different global communicative objectives, and we call them global communicative objectives because they are like candy. What does that mean? When we unwrap them, when we open them up, we find other objectives. So for example, if by the end of the lesson I want my students to be able to describe a pet, what do they need to learn to be able to do that? Well, to describe a pet, they will have to learn vocabulary related to animal pet names. They will have to probably learn vocabulary to talk about animals' parts of the body. They will probably have to learn adjectives to describe animals, and they will also have to learn has got and hasn't got to describe pets. So as you can see, that's why we call them global, because when we open them up, there are specific objectives. Let us imagine that by the end of the lesson, I want my students to be able to get the main idea from a text. The question is, what is it that they have to learn to be able to do that? So probably they will have to learn to skim through a text, or they might have to learn to scan through a text, and they will need opportunities to practice skimming and scanning, and then they will be applying that when reading a text to be able to extract the main idea. Let us imagine that by the end of a lesson or a sequence of lessons, I want my students to be able to write an informal letter. What do they need to learn in order to be able to write an informal letter? And there you go, you unwrap candy, and what do you find? Well, you find that first they need to know what an informal letter is, though. They need to know what genre or text type they will be writing. We will have to engage them in some sort of text analysis so that they learn what are the characteristics of an informal letter. So we will need to engage them in analysis. And then some of the things that they might have to learn are the typical expressions used in an informal letter. All right. They might also need to understand the kind of language that we use in an informal letter, which is clearly different from the language you would use in a formal letter. That's why we call them global, because when we unwrap them, there are things inside. So we've spoken about objectives and how important it is that they are smart. We have given examples of a global communicative objective, but now the time has come for us to put all the pieces together. So what do I mean by putting all the pieces together? I want you to see, because this is going to be very clear for you. Every time I plan a lesson, the first thing I have to think is, what is it that I want my students to be able to do by the end of that lesson or sequence of lessons, or by the end of those remote tasks? What is it that I want them to do? Once I've got it very clear in my mind, I can already start writing the global communicative objectives. So let's give an example now. By the end of the lesson, students will have to discuss or give a presentation called Why My Pet is More Than a Pet to Me. Once I've got it clear in my mind, I start writing the global communicative objectives. So in that final task, one of the things that students will have to do is describe their pet. There you are with your global communicative objective. My global communicative objective is that by the end of the lesson, one of the things that students will have to be able to do is describe their pet. You open up that global communicative objective, you unwrap the candy to find what is inside. And what do you have inside? The specific objectives. So for the global communicative objective, describe a pet, which are the specific objectives? Well, one of them is learning vocabulary related to pet names. Another specific objective is learning the parts of the body to be able to describe a pet. The third specific objective of that global communicative objective is that students will have to learn adjectives to describe a pet when it comes to personality or even physically. And fourth, another specific objective for that global communicative objective is that the students will have to learn the structure has got and hasn't got. Now, the purple arrow indicates that the other thing I have to think is what context or in what situation or through which task students will show me that they can do all that. So in this case, we are talking about a real life situation for which students can make personal connections. An example is, I want to talk about my pet. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to give a presentation or you will lead a discussion on why your pet is more than a pet to you. When you are discussing this topic or as you are presenting this topic, you're going to show me that you can describe a pet and that you know the vocabulary to talk about the name of your pet, that you can describe your pet physically because you've got the vocabulary, you can handle the vocabulary. You will show me that you can describe your pet in terms of personality and physically, and you will also show me that you master the language to describe has got and hasn't got. So that is why when we think about the objectives, they need to be measurable and they need to be observable in that scenario I was mentioning before. So we are reaching the end and the time has come to say, okay, we've discussed all the stages, we have talked about the objectives, we are absolutely ready to plan. And I have thought of something that will help you not only in a traditional context, in a traditional face-to-face class, but will also help you plan your lessons, whether they are online, whether they are synchronous, whether they are asynchronous, or if you cannot rely on technology and you have to design remote tasks to be sent home. I really think this planner is going to help you through the process. And if you think about it, I've called it Remote Tasks Planner, all right? And as I always say, if any of the instances here, if the presentation or the elicitation can be done through online teaching, go for it. But if you do not have the possibility, don't get in despair. This is going to help you out. So when you start planning your lesson, the first thing you have to think of are the global communicative objectives. By the end of this tasks guide or by the end of this lesson, you are addressing your student, because remember how important it is to share with them the objectives. You will be able to remember not to have 1,000 global communicative objectives, because remember that each of them is like candy. You unwrap them and they've got their specific objectives. So you write your global your global communicative objectives, and then the structure is presentation 1. Usually I present vocabulary here. Presentation 2, I match vocabulary, or I use that vocabulary for the presentation of grammar. That's why controlled practice here for me is integrated. It integrates vocabulary and grammar, and then I move from controlled practice to freer practice until eventually students can apply everything they've learned. So let us move on to an example. By the end of the remote assignment, because here I'm just thinking about a remote assignment, as I said before, if you have the possibility to do any online thing, go for it. I'm telling my students that they will be able to give advice and make suggestions for others to keep fit and healthy, and they will be able to explain to a doctor, for example, the circumstances of an accident. So if I want them to be able to do that by the end of that lesson, the first thing I have to present is vocabulary. So presentation of vocabulary 1, vocabulary related to health and fitness. After the presentation of vocabulary, I always engage them a little bit in this elicitation, like relate personally to the topic, and I ask them a couple of questions. So an example would be, if you want to keep fit, what can you do? What do you do when you're ill? What do you do to stay healthy? What can you do if you have an accident? Where can you go if you need to buy medicine? This is, remember, a stage called elicitation, all right, which I usually like including even in remote tasks. If I can do it online, I get interaction with students, but if not, I always try to include a little bit of elicitation. For example, how fit are you? How often do you work out? Do you have gym classes at school? Do you eat healthy food, etc.? And then I engage students in presentation too. As I said before, I present vocabulary first, and then I present grammar, but I integrate vocabulary. So in this case, I am presenting, all right, I am making them notice conditional type 0, all right? And I am using examples using the vocabulary I presented before. So this is going to help students figure out, notice not only the structure, but also the use of grammar in particular. So we have had the presentation of vocabulary and grammar, and now, of course, I'm going to engage students in what I call integrated control practice. Why is it integrated? Because they are practicing both vocabulary and grammar. And why is this an example of control practice? Because it's a typical multiple choice. It's very restricted. They have to choose out of 2 possibilities. Of course, I have given you an example, but I usually give several. After integrated control practice, we move on to integrated freer practice. As you will notice, now we let go, we remove 1 or 2 of the training wheels, all right? And here, for example, students have to build up 0 conditional sentences. So now it's not only about choosing out of 2 options, it's about building the sentence. Or I give them the possibility to complete sentence halves, all right? So it's a little bit more challenging, but still the focus keeps on being what? Conditional type 0 sentences and vocabulary related to health and fitness. And then, of course, an example of application. Now, all right, now you're the doctor, okay? You're the doctor, so you have to give some pieces of advice to patients. And of course, they will have to use the structures and the vocabulary, but they can also use any other prior language knowledge that they have to fulfill the task. So for example, here, we are presenting the past continuous, all right? And of course, again, embedded in the context that we were mentioning. So I was climbing a tree when I fell down. So we give examples. This is the presentation of grammar, all right? And then, of course, integrated control practice. Put the verbs in brackets into the past continuous or simple past. An example of typical, okay, gap fill within control practice. Last Sunday, for example, I bruised my arm when I was fighting with my brother. So again, we are here in this context of doctors and injuries and staying healthy and staying fit and whatnot. So again, okay, other examples. What were you doing when you cut your finger? Okay, I was cooking when I cut my finger. So we move, these are the examples of integrated freer practice. And of course, after freer practice, we move on to application. For example, here with these cue cards, students have to explain to the doctor what is it that they were doing before. So the doctor would be asking something such as, what were you doing when you sprained your ankle? Oh, I was running when I sprained my ankle. So they can have conversations. Why am I calling this an application stage? Because apart from using the target language, they can use other language that they have at their disposal. And the last example would be talking or discussing about an accident that you have had, where you would put everything to the test, okay? So we are done with module 3, and I just can't wait to see you in our last module, where we will be even going deeper into how to assess our students remotely.